Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you to all the organizers. This is a slightly peculiar setup in that we're going to have a conversation with each other with you in mind listening in. And it plays a little bit to what Bensi said at the beginning, that this whole project seems to straddle both the yeshiva and the academy in healthy ways in which they can collide in a positive sense and rub against each other, such that the insight of the educational practices of the yeshiva, as well as the particular forms of thinking that we do in the academy, when brought together, may be able to produce a third and more fruitful set of ideas. So just to say a few words about the Chavruta, it's not as if in the academy we don't have the ability to engage one another in conversation about our ideas. However, one dimension of academic thought is that a lot of that engagement happens when we've finished thinking. So the production of a paper to a journal will get reviewed, and you can improve it, and hopefully it will be accepted. Similarly, with monographs or giving papers at seminars, all of this comes after a tremendous amount of effort working alone. However, the Chavruta brings two people together where they can talk about things which they haven't yet formulated their ideas about it yet. And it allows for a different type of energy to generate a way of thinking. Now, what's important, I think, about the Chavruta is the way in which we all possess particular biases when we entertain a text. When we start reading a text, there's so many other thoughts that go through our minds. We have particular lenses which we see the world. And it's not as if we aren't capable of broader thinking, but it's often very difficult to self-regulate and allow oneself to have that freedom to think broadly, horizontally across a bunch of different disciplines. But with the Chavruta, someone can immediately bring up an alternative, diverse way of thinking about the text. And hopefully, thereby broadening each one of you's, each partner in the Chavruta's accessibility to the multiplicity of the text. So I think it's time to begin. We chose 3 sections from the booklets you have in front of you. We'll be starting on page 3, and we might even bring in some of the original Yiddish to emphasize some of the points. So here's the question about was hat Hasidus aufgetan, which was translated here about the innovation of Hasidus, or in Hebrew maybe the chidush. But what is the innovation of Hasidus, which the Rebbe RaSHaB seems to find to be a very peculiar question to ask? And I know what you think, Paul, that is it peculiar that he finds it peculiar?
Well, I did find this quite striking because I would have thought, and this goes back to the previous discussion about the revolution of Hasidism, I would have thought that given the resistance, which we haven't really talked about, that Hasidus encountered, that those who were so involved in propagating it and developing it would have had some account, at least for themselves, of what was new about it and what provoked that opposition. Because it was highly opposed with great intensity in some parts of Eastern Europe and indeed throughout Western Europe. It could have developed in Western Europe as well, and it started to develop, you could argue, in Frankfurt at exactly the same time. But the result of that was that Reb Nosson Adler, who was sort of a proto-tzaddik, Rebbe, ended up leaving Frankfurt and going east with his disciples, including the Chassam Sofer, who would become extremely important as a figure of resistance to modernity throughout Western Europe. But fundamentally, it didn't strike roots in Western Europe or in most of Lithuania. And that's an interesting thing. So again, I would have expected the leaders of Hasidism to have had some account of why that was and what was revolutionary about their thinking. And in fact, we do get one eventually in this discussion, but there's a resistance to thinking about it.
Yeah, so it seems like he's comfortable after his preamble to engage the question, but he wanted to make a sort of a macha. He's making this protest to start off. Like, this is not how someone approaches a text. Thinking automatically about, what is this project? That's a very typical academic question, right? So, what is the context? You have to give, we've had a whole session beforehand trying to give the context of what's going on in Hasidus so that we can now talk about Hasidus. So like the RaSHaB's like, let's just dive straight in. Like, why do you need to have a theory about what this text is about? You can have by reading it, you sort of like, it's the sort of thing that you sense and you get to know regardless of whether you have a working theory of what it is. Like developing that working theory seems, I think, to him to be a sort of a shallow and slightly superficial encounter with the text. What does he say? I was studying Hasidus on its own terms, not how it sits in relation to other things, which is a sort of a protest against this whole project because, we don't have to study Hasidus in relation to other things. We can study Hasidus on its own terms. And RaSHaB made this type of protest quite often. He had, even about Jewish philosophy. He claimed that he wasn't preoccupied or very interested in other Jewish philosophical works like the Guide and things, even though he wrote lots of commentaries on it. But it was a sort of a certain type of resistance to think about his project as and not an all-encompassing project that can hold its own, like it has its own foundations and can satisfy itself with itself.
In fact, that reminds me of perhaps the most perplexing sentence to me in your book, which I admired, which is that the Rebbe RaSHaB denied having read the great works of Jewish philosophy, even though he had written commentaries on them.
Yeah, and it's still perplexing to me as well. But I think he wanted to, I think as part of his social, we were talking about the mixture between ideas and the social projects. I think he really wanted to cultivate in his followers a tremendous self-confidence, which I think was very connected to the times which they were entering into modernity, that if a person feels that they're just sort of a faculty amongst many other faculties in the university, you might accept that there's a whole range of faculties and you're just you keep to your lane. I think he really felt that if Chabad was going to achieve anything, it had to have this supreme self-confidence bordering on arrogance about its intellectual history.
And I think, coming back to something you said before about the difference between academia and Jewish life, so academia, especially since the development of the research university in Germany in the 19th century, is really focused on the question, what's new here? What's the chiddush? What contribution are you making? You have to be able to explain how you're making a contribution in order to get a PhD and sort of become a member of the academic guild, whereas Judaism has a tendency to want to say, there's nothing new here. We're doing exactly what everybody always did. All Jews since Abraham Avinu, since Abraham, have always done this. And we see that already in Chazal, in rabbinic literature, where Avraham is said to have made an eruv and have known the intricate details of rabbinic law. So I think there's something like that here. And of course, the danger of reflecting on the reason why you're doing what you're doing, especially when there's opposition, is that you might become either polemical or apologetic. And in both ways, I suppose you could be accused, or you could accuse yourself of really straying far away from the essence of what you're trying to get to. And it would be an escape from the actual performance of the work required. Why not do the work as opposed to just talk about why we should do the work?
But then it's fascinating how when you go a generation later, you come to the Frierdiker Rebbe and the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he writes a number of long essays about what is Hasidus, and goes into it in quite a lot of depth. And you go a generation later with the Rebbe himself penning what's a seminal essay on the nature of Hasidic thought, and it becomes a much more being comfortable in their own skin in thinking about it, even though they do, it ultimately concludes that there's this sort of arch supremacy of Chabad thought, which transcends everything, including Kabbalah and everything. The whole of Jewish thought is illuminated and enhanced and uplifted by this revelation of Chabad Hasidus. So that they don't lose that supreme self-confidence, but the engagement with the question seems to be much more natural, comfortable. But maybe this is the moment where it becomes no longer a problematic discussion to be had. Should we move on to the next one? Okay.
In the end, the account that is given of what is new about Hasidus is in relationship to Kabbalah, and specifically to Lurianic Kabbalah. And nobody would doubt that in some important way Lurianic Kabbalah is the foundation of the vast majority of Jewish thought since the 16th, 17th century. And that includes both the Hasidic and non-Hasidic aspects of traditional Judaism. But it's clearly developed in very different directions. And we get this remarkable statement. Well, maybe we'll have a look at page 18, the middle paragraph. Kabbalah is only about containing divinity, giving divinity a human form in which divinity can be discerned and grasped, while Hasidus is about the unveiling of the capacities through which one understands divinity and through which the capacities become divine. So Hasidus builds on Kabbalah, but it goes a very important step beyond it. And there's a lot more to say about that, especially about this notion of unveiling. There's a little translator's note down here about that word hafshata and what the root is, which is the root of the same as pshat, which is hard to translate, but sometimes used to mean something like the apparent or surface meaning. So hafshata could be also the stripping away. That's also what it can mean. The root can mean to spread out or to strip off, or to spread the surface of something. And as I say, I've got, there's a lot more to say about the distinction, but the crucial contrast that I perhaps want to start with is containing. Kabbalah is about containing divinity, and the word used there is hagbalah, which is limiting, giving divinity a human form in which divinity can be discerned and grasped. And I think, Eli Reuben bringing up the notion earlier of mibesari echeza eloka, from my flesh or with my flesh, I see divinity, which is a Kabbalistic use of a term from the book of Job, and which is then brought into Hasidism, although it's certainly there in Kabbalistic texts beforehand, is very relevant here. That somehow human experience and human embodiment is central to the Hasidic enterprise and to the Kabbalistic enterprise, but the difference is that Hasidus actually transforms the body. It unveils the capacities. It has a transformative aspect on those embodied capacities, whereas Kabbalah is about attaining a vision, but not about transformation itself.
Yeah, but I think it creates a significant problem, this using these terms. In some parts it's Hagbalah, sometimes it's Halbosha. Halbosha and Hafshata, so as soon as you start imagining, you could think, very simply, getting dressed and getting undressed. Is it a transcendence? Hafshata, oftentimes we think of, transcending, and therefore it becomes slightly disconnected and detached from. And so if you follow each of your possible translations or modes of thinking about these words, I think it will give very wildly different interpretations. So, a lot of people study Hasidus and they think it's it's this act of primacy of the soul over the body. It's a transcendent type of approach, as opposed to an embodied experience. And they can be studying Hasidic texts, but they're missing sort of the relationships. I think there's like sort of a circularity going on, a bit of halbosha and hafshata. And instead of Kabbalah and Hasidus being sort of doing different projects, I think the point he's making is that Hasidus overcomes a particular problem we have with Kabbalah. And that is the problem of creating very fixed boundaries and definitive terms about divinity and about godliness. And so the adept at Hasidus is able to dive into those interpretations. They can think about Chochmah of Atzilus, the divine wisdom as it is in the world of emanations, and at the same time not get stuck there. They can move beyond it because they see that anything in this discussion is going to have a certain roundedness, because everything is always going to somehow, if we anchor ourselves in the idea of divine unity, then there's no outside and there's no inside, because everything ultimately is consumed within that. So whilst wanting to have the rigorous engagement with the difference between Chachma and Bina, it's having the capacity to see Chachma and Bina in unison. And I think we talk about it later, like Yichud Kutsha Brichu Shchinte. So instead of thinking of the levels of Zah and Malchus and the different Sfirot in Atzilus as being these sort of competing forces, or if you go back to the Midrash and you want to talk about Midas Hadin and Midas Harachamim, the divine qualities of judgment and mercy, or justice and mercy, then we get stuck in a certain binary thinking. And I think one of and especially when you see in the later explanations of what is Hasidus in the Rebbe's essay, it's this sort of essential quality that can overcome all these differences without obliterating them at the same time. So it's a much more, I would say, complicated operation. I think most people, their natural state, especially a Western thinker, is more comfortable in the Kabbalah model than in the Hasidus model, because it gives them a certainty, it gives them a clarity, it gives them a differences, it puts everything into its neat boxes, and it's more comfortable in that space. Whereas to admit the fluidity of the categories between all the things you're studying, whilst at the same time holding them as being definitive in some useful way, takes a different type of mindset and activity. It's different intellectual activity entirely, I think. But I don't know if that's a fair description of Kabbalah, or whether it's polemical in the sense. It falls into this sort of polemical approach of just like straw manning the Kabbalah in order to give us what we want out of the Hasidus. Do you think it's fair?
Yeah, I mean, I would use Kabbalah in a more expansive sense, which would probably include Hasidus here, especially because it is connected to receiving, which is the function of a kli, or a vessel. And that's very important to the Rebbe RaSHaB's views as well. That's part of what we're trying to become, vessels for the divine light. So in that sense, this is really a continuation of the project of Kabbalah.
Right. I think I can understand why you would want to think that. But do you understand why the Rebbe RaSHaB would not want to think that?
Only insofar as he does in the end want to emphasize that there's something genuinely new about Hasidus.
So this question of newness, I mean, if you think like historically, chronologically, it's coming post certain elements of Kabbalah, post the Lurianic Kabbalah.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's a new thing, it's a novel thing. But at the same time, I think it wants to situate itself as sort of primordial to everything, and deeply linked to earlier hermeneutics of Midrash and in that form. So Kabbalah is just a sort of an offshoot into one direction, but Hasidus is in the main body of things and can operate with a much bigger and a broader canvas when it thinks about the ideas.
In fact, I go even further than you do there, not only going back and being primordial in terms of the history of Judaism, but primordial in a cosmic sense as well. And this has to do, again, with another text that Ali Reuven mentioned, about going back to the primordial or Ein Sof, to the light of the infinite, and even at an earlier stage. I mean, okay, so maybe I have to say something about this word pshat. A very, very brief tour starting in 6th century Greece, but moving very quickly. Right, so in Greece there's a tradition of allegorically interpreting Homer and Greek myth, and understanding the terms which are often quite anthropomorphic, very human terms for divinity, often quite crude events and so on, understanding them in more appropriate philosophical ways. And when the Torah is translated into Greek, the same questions get raised about descriptions of God in human or in corporeal terms. We have, if it's authentic, then a very early conversation between Ptolemy, one of the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt, who's responsible for that translation, and a Jewish Aristotelian philosopher called Aristobulus about just this topic. And Aristobulus gives the same answer that the Greek philosophers were giving, which is that you have to understand these terms allegorically. And and just if it talks about God taking Israel out of Egypt with a mighty hand, it's just like saying the king has a mighty hand. You're not really talking about his hand. You're talking about the power of the king, and all these things can be understood in the proper allegorical way. And that becomes a fundamental principle of Jewish interpretation. And the Rambam is perhaps the most rigorous version of it. When Kabbalah arises or becomes public, you have the same question, because Kabbalah often seems to revel in anthropomorphic descriptions of God or characterizations of divine action. So should those also be understood allegorically or not? And with Lurianic Kabbalah, that is heightened yet again. So now in the 16th century, and the question arises in the first generations of the reception of Lurianic Kabbalah, whether to understand these matters kifshuto or lo kifshuto. Now, kifshuto has a very specific meaning. It means non-allegorically, or you use the rules of grammar and our historical and linguistic knowledge and parallel passages and so on to understand the text, but it's not an allegorical reading. Whereas lo kifshuto means it's an allegorical meaning. There's some sort of philosophical code that you need to unlock the significance of these terms and to understand the passages. And this was a big debate, especially in the early 18th century in Italy, between Rav Yosef Ergas and Rebbe Manuel Chai Ricci, sort of a polemical debate about how to understand Lurianic Kabbalah. This is very important to Chabad, as far as I understand it. I don't claim to be a scholar of Chabad, but Chabad positions itself already in the Tanya and other foundational works very much on the side of the allegorical reading, lo kifshuto. So if you now say that Hasidus is about hafshata, it means you can also translate that as something like becoming the surface meaning. And it anticipates, I think, the next text. I don't remember which page it's on. Yeah, page 33. Well, just the title of this is enough, really, which is the metaphor becomes the metaphorized, or the allegory becomes the allegorized. So it's one thing to have an allegorical account and a sort of philosophical, theological code to unlock that account. And that's what traditional Kabbalah is doing, according to this discussion. And it's something else to transform the terms of the allegory so that they themselves become divine. And that seems to be the big claim here.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is the big claim. That in the act of hafshatas hakoiches, the innovation of Hasidus being this, say, further allegorization of the material, such that the division between the allegory and the allegorized becomes insignificant, because they just. And I think the usual interpretation of this is that when a scholar is has a deep understanding of an idea and wishes to communicate it, and they develop a metaphor, an allegory to share that idea with their audience, the author of the allegory, the speaker, sees within what they've just said the full dimensions and the full profundity of their original thought. And the division between themselves and the expression of this idea is insignificant and is irrelevant. However, for the audience, They're only privy to the allegory to start with, or to the metaphor, which they're able to easily grasp, unlike the original profound idea. However, through study, through continuing engagement with the teacher, the student should be able to come to the point where they see the full profundity of the idea as it was in the allegory. And in a way, the student has an advantage over the teacher, because the teacher starts off originally without any of this hiddenness and darkness and confusion. There's no blockage between their idea and the expression of the idea. However, for the student, they're only privy to the expression of the idea through the allegory. And then they have to do this working over. And that is, in a sense, the avodah of Hasidus, this like hard work, both intellectually and emotionally, to be able to see this metaphor in all of its profundity, such that it becomes so luminous and so synonymous that you don't even need to go beyond it, because it has everything there. And I'm just going to say, on a personal level, I remember when I first encountered this phrase, "Hamoshel nasa nimshel." I think I saw it in Hebrew before in the Yiddish, "Hamoshel veta nimshel," and it wasn't. I remember it as an intellectual experience that very unparalleled in my life. And I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what I didn't know. I couldn't explain to you what it meant, but I felt there was it was doing something that was breaking all the rules. And if I could figure out what that meant, I'd be onto something good. And it's rare that you sort of, it's a simple phrase, "Hamoshel nasa nimshel," but it breaks all the rules of what a moshel is and what a nimshel is. Because the very benefit of a moshel is it's not a nimshel. If it was the same as the nimshel, you wouldn't need the moshel. And so the idea that you can intellectually analyze something, including yourself, such that you become so worked over and so permeated with the thing that you're pointing towards, that you become that thing itself, is devastating and frightening in so many ways. Like, maybe you don't want to become the nimshel. There's a certain comfort in the moshel. The moshel allows a person to have this comfortable space where it's on my terms, the way I understand things. And then you're happy that the communicator, the teacher, they have the access to the nimshel. And you just get like little drops and things that sort of a reflection of that. And it's a comfortable learning. But the idea that myself in all of my intellectual horizons are really so porous, such that they can have access to everything, puts all of us in a very precarious place. And I think that's like the scariness. This text, I feel, is a very demanding text, the very idea that you become divine incarnate. If we're going to be honest, what he's trying to say here is that you become divinity. And then what happens?
So I think any claim to transformative power is scary, because it means giving up your previous identity. There's something scary about that, and there's something that provokes resistance in it. But I also think there is something genuinely new here. It's always dangerous academically to claim something's new, because then someone else is going to come along and find something in the 14th century or whatever it is. But that long history of allegory, which I only hinted at, starting in 6th century BCE Greece, I don't know anything like this claim, really. It's something new.
And I love how he says, it happens so automatically. He understands the divine through his own faculties until the faculties become refined to the point that they are transformed into godliness. The metaphor becomes the metaphorized.
But that may take us back to the earlier question about why there's a resistance to reflection. This is something that happens automatically. It's experiential. It's transformative. It's not really on a reflective level. It's not really something that has to be the topic of the discussion. It's what you undergo.
Yeah, if you maintain a certain self-consciousness in the act of learning Hasidus. So if the idea is that a person learns Hasidus, they're able to varying degrees, obviously not entirely, but to some degree, experience this transformation if they're constantly taking notes about what's going on and keeping a journal about this moment. The mashal became a nimshal for me. It probably is not happening. You can't be the observer of this experience. And so asking the question, in a sense, undermines the whole chiddush of Hasidus. And the RaSHaB was, I wouldn't say unique in the Chabad corpus, but he definitely stands out as one who demanded a level of immersion in Hasidic thought amongst his followers he saw as, and in his own systemization of Chabad Hasidic thought. People may have historically studied Hasidus before the RaSHaB, but they maybe didn't know how to put all the pieces together. And the RaSHaB just gives it to you on a plate, what's really going on in the broad corpus of Hasidic thought. And his expectation that people could, if they just sort of put themselves aside and threw their minds into it, and bury themselves in the Hasidic thought, then all these wondrous things could happen automatically. We wouldn't have to have this sort of reflection about what is supposedly happening.
And this raises a couple of questions for me. One is that a couple of times you referred to Chabad Hasidic thought, but mainly to Hasidic thought. Are those just the same thing? Right, so there's lots of branches of Hasidus. Chabad is a very important one. Nobody, I think, questions that. But if this is the central innovation of Hasidus, is it one that's uniquely developed by Chabad and everybody else just doesn't get it? Or is there some Chabad account of what the other branches of Hasidus are doing?
I mean, I think the RaSHaB's view is that it's, when he says Hasidus, he means Chabad Hasidus. He means the Hasidus of the Baal Shem Tov as refracted through the Chabad school. I don't think there's much room in his worldview for the various other branches of Hasidic thought. And there we see interesting tensions. There's a popularity in the study of Hasidus in a whole range of circles, even like just this room, the idea that there's, it's not the exclusive domain of people in yeshivas Teimchei Tamimim, but rather people are, and especially in Israel now, a lot of the yeshivas have it included in their curriculum. And you see the organization in Israel, Tzama, they put on these Yutas Kislev conferences, and you see a very broad spectrum of people are studying Hasidus, and they're thinking about it. And I find it fascinating because the people internal to Chabad, they still follow pretty much the Rebbe RaSHaB's approach. You don't think about what it's doing, you just do it. You just learn the Hasidus, and there isn't a huge amount of self-reflection. But people from the outside studying Hasidus now are realizing how it rubs up against so many of their priors and their assumptions and their ideas. And they have to either reinterpret the Hasidus or they have to reinterpret themselves. or they live with that tension. But it's very interesting to sometimes see how far, I don't think it would have been the sharp contrast between the different ideas aren't readily discernible to the inside world of Chabad. Whereas this new encounter, I think, is extremely fascinating, and hopefully the efforts of this institution of trying to sort of figure out where is this novelty, because the novelty will come out when someone says, "You can't say that." We've never said that, and then all of a sudden you realize, wow, this is an innovative idea if people react so violently to it. And I think what we were discussing earlier, if we were to study what the opponents of Hasidus had to say about Hasidus, we'd probably learn a lot more about what Hasidus is, because those ideas were the ones that triggered them into this sometimes even violent opposition.
I think connected to that question, I have another one, which goes back to Glenn Tyner's talk about the social dimensions of Hasidus are very evident to us today. And if we look back, we can see that social dimension, the relationship to the Rebbe, developing not all at once, but gradually during the 18th, early 19th century. And to some extent, although it has its distinctive features, Chabad fits into that picture. It's a new social arrangement. It has a Rebbe and so on. so do all these other groups. What does that social arrangement have to do with this fundamental idea, this fundamental innovation?
Well, no, these talks, as we see it through them, there's like a discussion going on as well. It's not this sort of Rebbe sitting on a throne giving this communication, because as opposed to a maimah, this is a sikha. Yeah. And the maimah has that element of, divine wisdom being channeled through the tzaddik and communicated to the people. But the sikha is a different social organization, because you've got the Rebbe sitting with his Hasidim, they're asking questions, they're telling stories, he's responding. And even though we see, go forward a few, 2 generations, that the Rebbe, even when the Rebbe was saying sikhas, it was quite formal, but definitely with the Frierdiker Rebbe and his father, their sikhas were, these Farbrengens were very socially engaged, a very new relationship that you could, sit around drinking and talking to your Rebbe. It changes things, and you can ask these types of questions. And so I think the development of this idea becomes possible because of this social arrangement. In the Chabad context, this idea of the Farbrengen, which although existed earlier to some, but that was between Hasidim. The idea of the Rebbe Farbrenging with Hasidim in that type of fraternal way is quite new. And I think that affords the ability for those types of questions to be asked and those types of questions to be answered. We got 5 minutes, 5 minutes ago, I think.
Yeah, I'm curious about this. Like, we're talking so much about this word Hasidus and kind of this concept. And like, as far as I can tell, the people who we understand now as kind of, the founders of Hasidism, like they certainly didn't know the word Hasidism, they didn't speak English, but they also, didn't refer to what they were doing necessarily as like Hasidus, right? Like the Alter Rebbe, we don't have the Siddur im Hasidus, we have the Siddur im Dach, right? They refer to it as different things. And so it's interesting kind of like this meta discussion about Hasidus. Obviously we refer to all this as Hasidus, but just like kind of the Ri and Rabbeinu Tam didn't sit down and say, okay, let's write the Tosfos. Like, when did this understanding of this activity come to be known as Hasidus? And like, do you have an idea of like when that switched over from, Midat HaChasidut, even like some like Shneur Zalman would refer, that just meant piety, and it didn't mean, mystical drush that comes about after the Baal Shem Tov. So like, do you have an idea of when that kind of transition took place?
Yeah. Another text I would recommend to see, like, if you want to go to earlier texts, to think about like when, because obviously no one sort of decided to write the protocols of the Hasidic movement, and then it was announced in a press statement that we are now Hasidim. Obviously, it would have been a gradual sense. A lot of it came from the opposition, and there's a fascinating text that was the deposition of the Alter Rebbe when he was imprisoned, based on the sort of the accusations that was led by the opponents of Hasidim, the Misnagdim. And he had to basically defend his position and explain his position. And he does a tremendous amount of work explaining the nature of Hasidic prayer, how it's different, how it used to be, and we've just had a few hundred years interim where the profundity of prayer has been lost, and we're just like restoring the greatness of prayer, because that was one of the accusations about him, like starting a new. The accusations was that you can't in the Russian Empire start a new religion. So he was arguing that Hasidus is not a new religion, so much as a restoration of authentic Judaism. So it's I think it's a fantastic text. It's published in Kerem Chabad, and it gives a sense early on. So we're talking, the late 18th century, of what they were thinking about themselves.
I'll just add to that I think it's connected to the early use of the term Hasid, which is really an ascetic, Kabbalistic practitioner. So the Vilna Gaon, for all of his opposition to what we now call Hasidus, was known as the Chassid. But in that ascetic sense, so I think it goes back to a letter which I think Glenn brought up from the Baal Shem Tov to his disciple, the author of the Toldos Yaakov Yosef. Don't fast. Right? That's the wrong thing to do. That's what the old Hasidim did, although the term is not used there. Instead, you should occupy yourself with the simcha shel mitzvah, with the joy of commandment. Now, the truth is, you'll find both ideas in early Kabbalistic and Musar texts. So in a way, that's not new. It's just saying that asceticism is the wrong approach that is the new thing. So I think there's an idea of a new conception of what piety or Hasidus consists in, which eventually became the name of a movement.
Hi. First of all, thank you both. I have a question which both of you did touch on briefly, but I wonder if I can hear more of your thoughts. So it seems like he's making a radical claim that the innovation of Hasidus is the metaphor becoming the metaphorized. And I'm curious, presumably in Kabbalah and medieval Jewish philosophy, they use metaphors, right? Metaphors are used. So is it that in Hasidus, metaphors are used in a different way? Are the kinds of metaphors different? In essence, in what sense is this innovative to Hasidus?
I don't know, but what I think is in the study of anything, when you decide to give a metaphor for what you're saying the same thing again, and there's just in a different form. It seems to be the function of the mashal. And the ability to do that, to sort of reproduce thought, create thought, is a profound quality and ability. So we have in the Gemara the idea that that we lost the Moshli Mashalim. We no longer have someone who can say a mashal. I think the Mashalim of Hasidus, which are obviously drawn from Kabbalah, this idea that the Chachma Shebenefesh, that a person's own intelligence, their own Chabad. So we as sentient human beings, we have this thing called Chabad. And our Chabad is really a mashal for the Chabad of Atzilus, because that's where it originates from. That's already a mashal. And in the act of saying that mashal, it's also an act of creating that thought, like extending. Atzilus now becomes extended into the human psyche. And that is, because treating Hasidus as a sort of not just from a historical perspective, a development of ideas of a bunch of intellectuals, but in its own inner consciousness of being a revelation, an actual process of the revelation of the Torah that started at Har Sinai and is continuing through each Rebbe when they're saying a Maimah. And when they're saying this idea of the Chabad Shebenefesh is really a mashal for the Chabad of Atzilus, it's also creating that reality. It's making that mashal. So I think there's a distinct, I'm not arguing for or against it. I'm just saying that the self-awareness of what a Rebbe is doing when they're making a mashal. They don't always say mashal. Sometimes you'll say al derech dugma. You'll have like sort of an example, which sometimes it's hard to see the boundary. On uroim b'muchash, we see this clearly. Is that a mashal? I'm not so sure. But there are certain sort of big, major, conceptual mashalim that Hasidus brings and emphasizes again and again and works them over again and again. Again, drawn from the Kabbalah. A lot of the imagery is very similar. But I think the project is to make a mashal is what means that when the person absorbs or lives out that mashal, their Chabad Shebenefesh becomes a Chabad Shebenefesh which is permeated with its own metaphor. Then it becomes truly inseparable from the original idea because it's extended that idea to its fullest. I don't know if that answered the question.
Well, there's a hermeneutics here, but there's also a metaphysics underlying the hermeneutics. So the idea, as I understand it, is that the infinite light, or Ein Sof, is already a desire to communicate, to propagate. The point of talking about light is that light is, the fastest means of communication that we know, physically speaking, and it's the same in the spiritual sense. So, and then what that gives rise to in Kabbalah Sari is Tzimtzum. It's the contraction or the concealment of the light. Because without that, the communication can't take place. There can't be an adequate recipient. So that's the birth, as I understand it, of the mashal. That's the birth of the parable. That's already, this world, as we experience it right now, is a mashal. It's a concealment of the light, which allows the light to be communicated. And the innovation of Hasidus is meant to be returning, but in an enriched way, to Sefes Or, is a term that Ali Reuven brought up before, the addition of the light, to that primordial state enhanced before the Tzimtzum, before the need for mashal. So it's a deeper form of communication. It's a transformative sort of communication. And if I may just say one last thing about that, which is, I think the precedent for this is in the history of Kabbalah. So already when the ideas of the Ari began to become known in the 16th century, and people quite naturally raised the question of what's their relationship to the ideas of his predecessor in Tzfat, Ramak, Ramosha Cordovero. And I think it's Ramami Fano, Menachem Azaria Fano, who is the first to say that it's a question of how high one ascends, that all of the Kabbalistic worlds with which Ramak dealt were in the category of Olam HaTikun, the worlds of rectification. But the Ari thought ascends even higher to Olam HaTohu, the world of chaos, the world of the coming to be of Atzilus, of the world of emanation. So now the big, bold claim in the text that we've been reading is that Hasidus goes even further than that, before the Tzimtzum that initiates the formation of the emanated spheres and so on. It goes even beyond that.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really interested I think one of you spoke about the need to be self-conscious when understanding the mashal as an imshal, and I'm interested as to whether or not either of you in your personal lives have done that self-conscious work of understanding that, and how that happened, what the process was like, if you're willing to share.
I'm reluctant to say, but who cares? Let's do it. We'll see what Bensi thinks about this afterwards. We'll have what to discuss over lunch. So this past Shabbos, I was in Crown Heights with a collection of students from Cambridge having their first encounter there. And one of the peculiar things is when you bring somebody into that type of realm who's not used to it, many of the things that those of us who have become familiar with certain practices and behaviors, you realize how innovative they are in the broader Jewish world. And so it takes quite a lot of engagement of cultural translation. And one of the most prominent things that needs to be dealt with when going to Crown Heights, and I suppose it goes back to the whole history of Hasidism, is this relationship with the Rebbe. And we were discussing how the encounter of a Chassid with their Rebbe is a moment that is like a mashal. The Rebbe becomes this sort of transparent conduit to divinity and to holiness. And through their physical presence, it means that the Chassid doesn't have to go through all of these mystical incantations that maybe the Baal Shem Tov was talking about and was told that we all have to be able to achieve to have these ascents. But whether in non-Chabad Hasidus, that happens in a sort of vicarious way through a Rebbe. But in the Chabad sense, it happens maybe a bit more as a joint project between the Chassid and the Rebbe to achieve that type of clarity. And that's the ultimate benefit. And even though the Rebbe is no longer physically there, the importance to Chabad Chassidim of going to the Rebbe's Oyhel and going into the Rebbe's room as a place where the Rebbe's physicality is pronounced is a means to achieve that. And in that discussion, there was some pushback, and also it was a broad discussion about like, how is that relevant to somebody? You know, I celebrated my 34th anniversary of this Shabbos of my first time going into 770. And I therefore have these memories. And so these rooms and these spaces where they don't reflect the Rebbe's presence in the way they did, for me, they still do, in a way. And it's hard then to communicate that to somebody, or to share that, or to give that as an inheritance to somebody else who hasn't had that experience. And the discussion revolved around saying that actually what we see is, in a sense, the moshel has become the nimshel in this relationship. That whereas there was this two-step relationship previously, that people had a relationship with the Rebbe, and then that helped them in their relationship with God, because it became like a sort of a metaphor for divinity and holiness. Now, all of those things have been dissolved in a way that is capable of greater illumination than was previously possible. Because we know from the Alter Rebbe saying that one of the problems of being a tzaddik is that to be effective, you've got to be alive. But when you're alive, you can only really give over a very mere reflection of what you know and what you have access to. But upon your passing, that gives you a certain liberation, and all of the people you're connected to, you can have a much deeper and profound relationship with them, notwithstanding the lack of that physical encounter. And so, in some ways, seeing the sort of the encounter that was possible this weekend with many students coming to New York, which sort of didn't happen during the Rebbe's lifetime. We're observing, and you asked me about a personal experience, but there's a certain observation of Moshel Nasa Nimshol in a confusing way, admittedly, and potentially uncontrolled way. We don't know how it's going to manifest over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, what that's going to look like for the Jewish people. But there's something going on whereby there is this, you can sort of observe a transition. And I think that people have observed in the history of Hasidism sort of the move away, the original tzaddik model becoming more diffused, and you described it like yeshiva and the learning being a space. So this decentralization of the Hasidic ethos is, at least in the Chabad model, is now becoming somewhat manifest in a very noticeable way.
So I come from a different tradition outside Chabad, closer to the world of the Lithuanian yeshiva, and I'm a student of the students of Rav Dessler, who felt very close to Chabad, so much so that when he was considering leaving Gateshead in Northeast England, where I grew up, he had a dream about the Balatanya appearing to him, telling him what to do. But so what is it to be a misnagid? What is it to be an opposer of Hasidus? So I would say it doesn't mean to be the opposition exactly anymore. And Rav Dessler incorporated Chabad into the study of Musar and so on. And I think that's a very important move, which I'm 100% behind. But it means to be a critic. The danger of the claim to transformative experience, of apotheosis, becoming divine, is that when you think you're God, and you're not fully God, there's still an ego there. Some bad consequences can follow from that. And I think in addition to encouraging this transformative experience, we need the critical reflection with which this whole discussion began, and we need a bit of internal criticism as well.
Okay, thank you both so much. Really, really appreciate it.